Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and to the final interview in celebration of Dominican Independence Month. I have with me here Maceo. A lot of you guys already know who Maceo is. You've seen him on my live streams on my channel. You've seen him in other live streams from other YouTubers that I'm associated with. So Maceo is no stranger to this community. So Maceo, how are you?
Good evening, Miss Tina. How are you? I'm doing good.
Good. I'm doing all right. So today's interview is going to be a little different. I think up until now, most of the interviews with other Dominicans that I've done have been more centered around like identity politics more than anything. And just kind of the stereotypes that exist about us, be it in the media or social media. We haven't gotten real historical in any of them yet. However, today, we are going to take it back and get into some of the actual history, but not just any part of the history. We're going to be focusing more specifically on the colonial period of Santo Domingo. And I think this is really important because I think a lot of times when looking at Dominican history, we look at it as if it starts at the War of Independence. Basically after we gained our independence from Haiti, that's when our history starts. We don't really look much further back than that. Like, we know vaguely what happened, but we don't really dig into that part of history, like those first 300 years. So that's what we're going to be doing today. But before we get into all that, I do just want to get a little bit into Maceo's background. So as a lot of you know, Maceo is half Dominican and half Puerto Rican. Now, Maceo, a lot of people already know that you also did recently do an interview on Radical Latinos channel, and you kind of went into this. But for anyone who may have missed it, could you just give us a little background about yourself and your experience being from both cultures?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in New York, Puerto Rican father, Dominican mother. I was primarily raised in the suburbs. I was born in New York City, but because of the things that were happening inside of New York City, my own man didn't want me to be raised in that kind of environment. The neighborhood was starting to get a little rough. Drugs were starting to come in, so he decided to take me out. And we moved into the suburbs. And in the beginning, like, I knew that where my parents came from, but it just never really dawned on me until much later on in life how important that was going to be in my own formation as a person. And I grew up with people that did not look like me, that didn't speak the language that we spoke at home, that did not have anything really in common with me other than the fact that we were supposedly Americans. As time went on, not so much during elementary school, but it was in elementary school where my parents started sending me to the Dominican Republic. Up until this point, the only place I had traveled by plane was to Puerto Rico, and I was only maybe 3 or 4 years old, so I barely remember that. But from the time I was about 7 or 8, then I started traveling to the Dominican Republic, and it was more memorable because I wouldn't stay there for 2 or 3 weeks. I would stay there for 2 or 3 months. So generally, over summer vacations and anytime things were getting a little tight, because my parents were working class people, anytime that things were getting a little tight around the house, they would send me to the Dominican Republic. When I started getting into middle school, that's when most of the racist, that's when I really started getting exposure to racism. They would tell me all sorts of things. They would tell me, you're not really American. You were born here, but you're not from here. You're a spick. You're a nigger. You're a spigger. They called me all sorts of names, and they would make fun of my hair. Like, my parents would go months without cutting my hair, so my hair would grow up. So at that time, chia pets started coming out. And they would, oh, look, he's got chia pet hair and stuff. I remember one of the kids actually invited me to a pool party, and I went into the pool and I had like a little mini fro going on, right? So I go into the water, and when I get out, my fro stayed exactly the same. So like these white kids were like nudging each other, like, look at this kid's hair. Look at, what are you, like half a nigger or something? So it marked me. It made me become more aware of my own identity as a Afro Latino Caribbean person. And it came to a point that during my teen years, I actually got really involved. I grew up like listening to hip hop and stuff like that. But around the time I was around 15, I started immersing myself in Dominican and Puerto Rican culture.
Okay.
And by the time I was like in my later teens, early adulthood, I started really uh, reading about the history of the Dominican Republic and the history of Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, something very interesting that you have kind of talked about is you discovered that you have Moorish ancestry dating further back. And I know you really were getting into searching about your ancestry and like the haplogroups you descend from. And I mean, as you can tell by your name, Maceo and Moro. So it seems like that's something you're very proud of, and I guess that you really identify with. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you discovered about your ancestry?
Well, it's really funny because when I did this ancestry thing, I was basically just focused on the triracialness of Latin Caribbean people. So you had the Spanish, the African, and the native, which would be Taino.
Mm-hmm.
I never really looked past any of that, right? So it didn't. As I started getting involved with African-based religions, and I started seeing the different African influences in the Caribbean, primarily from the Congo and from the Yoruba, I started getting deep into things like spiritism and things like that that had a very heavy Spanish influence in it. When I was always interested in the origin of my ancestry, because every time I would ask, especially like my mother's side of the family, well, where did we come from? They really didn't know. They would just say they would just say they were Dominican.
Yeah.
But I saw that they were like very melanated. I mean, I think I showed you pictures of my family. They were very of my Dominican side of the family, so they were very melanated as to where the Puerto Rican side of my family wasn't really. They looked more. I wouldn't say Iberian per se, but they looked more mestizo than anything else.
Okay.
So as I started looking at the Congo and the Yoruba and this and that and so on and so forth, I started getting interested in the things of Spain. When I took my ancestry, at first I did it through ancestry.com. I got the results. It was basically everything I expected it to be. Didn't really think about it. A while later, I did it through 23andMe. 23andMe gave me, at the beginning, pretty much the same kind of results, but it included my haplogroups. Now,
Mm-hmm.
when I took a look at my mother's haplogroup, I didn't really read the fine print because I just, how they say, lo leí por encimita. So I just kind of like breezed through it, and it said North African and or Canarian, so from the Canary Islands.
Mm.
And when I understood the Canary Islands, I automatically, because I had read a little bit about it, I automatically thought of the Guanche. So I was
Mm.
like, okay, cool. You know, it was my father's ancestry that started really to intrigue me a little bit because it was Semitic. So
Mm.
then I was like, okay, all right, all right, all right. But I left it alone. I didn't really do much. I played around with it, but it wasn't really until I started getting involved in this in the community that you're associated with that I really started to take a good look, because I hadn't logged on to these sites in a while. I started taking a really good look at these haplogroups and the updated ancestry. Not so much on ancestry.com, but on 23andMe. And then I actually started to read my mother's haplogroup, and it turns out that her haplogroup, that she from her haplogroup, she's a descendant of the Moors. So
Mm.
her haplogroup originates in what is present day Morocco. Okay.
Okay.
And now I'm no math expert, but looking at the timeline, it coincides pretty much when the Moors entered Iberia or Hispania, whatever you want to call it, and
Mm.
and took it over. So I started looking up videos about this. I started further researching it, and I further validating that she is in fact a descendant of the Moors that conquered Spain.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Wow.
and so I've been looking over, like Moorish, basically the whole 800-year period of when the Moors were in control of Al Andalus, which is where Andalusia comes from, which is the southernmost most portion of Spain, through
Mhm.
23 and Me, when they gave me the map of Spain, and the strongest incidence of my DNA comes from Andalusia and the Canary Islands.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
now with my father, that's a whole different other thing because my father is Semitic. So
Mm.
when I talked to my old man about this, and now he lives in the Dominican Republic. He's pretty old. He doesn't really understand any of this. So I asked him, I was like, "Do you know anything about this Semitic ancestry?" And he told me that when he was a kid, he had heard rumors, but they were just rumors. So at this point, I'm pretty sure that my old man is of Sephardic ancestry when it
Wow.
comes to the Iberian Peninsula. So
Okay.
that made me question everything, because if you would have told me 10 years ago, hey, look, you're now people are romanticizing the Roman Empire. If you would have told me that 10 years ago, I would have probably that I was a descendant of the Roman Empire. I probably would have agreed with you because there would have been no comeback to it.
Yeah.
But now, being that my haplogroups have been revealed, doesn't seem like that's the case.
Right. Wow. No, that's very interesting. I wish there was a way for me as a female to know like my paternal line where that comes from, but I can't find that out because I don't have a Y chromosome. But anyway, that's really cool that you were able to figure that out and trace where both of your paternal and your maternal lineages come from, and to find out that you do in fact come from both a Moorish and Sephardic lineage. That's really cool. I mean, that's really interesting.
The funny thing is that it wasn't until a couple of months ago, I think I showed you the messages of a person that belongs to the same exact subclade that I belong to,
Uh-huh.
and he's Jewish. So then he was like, "Oh yeah, there's a lot of Jews in this." I'm like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah, you probably have Sephardic ancestry." So he put me on to a Sephardic rabbi. He put me on to a Palestinian Christian. He put me on to a Palestinian Muslim. He put me on to an Ethiopian that belongs to the same subclade.
Uh-huh.
I saw a comment from a British guy who belongs to the same subclade that seemed to be very surprised that
Mm.
there are all these Jews running around in our subclade. So he
Yeah.
basically said that now he has to rethink his paternal line.
Mm. And that's very interesting, especially considering how certain people in this little community feel about them. But I mean,
Well,
the truth is, there are a lot of Hispanics or people from Latin America have Jewish or Sephardic ancestry.
yeah, I definitely would like to explore that even further. I think there's a history there that needs to be told.
Mm.
And also I mean, what the Moors did in Spain was introduce a whole different other level of civilization, of science, architecture, philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just gonna say it, hygiene. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot to be proud of.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. Now, you kind of already mentioned how you developed an interest in wanting to further explore Dominican history, but I wanted to ask, I know that you identify as both a Dominican and a Puerto Rican nationalist, and
Yep.
there are certain figures between both Dominican and Puerto Rican history that I guess you kind of follow or identify their ideology a bit
Hmm.
more.
Yeah.
So, focusing more on the Dominican aspect, what makes you identify as a nationalist, and what does that mean to you?
Well, people, first off, a nationalist is somebody who wants to further and protect the national interests of his nation.
Hmm.
A nationalist is a protector of his nation. Now, I understand that this word has got a certain connotation to it that people think that it's bad. It's
Yeah,
not bad. Can it be used for bad? Absolutely. Can
right.
it be misconstrued into something that it's not? Absolutely. Can it be used for a fascist ideology? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not about any of that. I'm just
Yeah.
not. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm very satisfied to know that in history I would have, I would have been for the Dominican nation. I would have been for Dominican nationhood against pretty much all foreign intervention, all foreign empires, including Spanish. I mean, there's no way in hell I would ever sell out, especially now knowing my history.
Yeah.
There's no way I would ever sell out to Spain or any other European power.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? I don't believe in anti-Haitianism. I believe that the Dominican nation is separate from Haiti. I believe that we deserve to be our own country. But I would never, ever, ever look at a Haitian as if he's something inferior, or if he or she is inferior. I would never look at the history of that country and feel that it's inferior. And I'm gonna say it. I believe that we have a fraternal relationship based on land, and if we don't figure out how to make this work, I'll tell you what. If we don't learn how to cohabitate and serve each other's interests because we occupy the same island, if we try to sow the seeds of division, we will most certainly die together. Because I firmly believe there are European and American elements out there that would love nothing better than for Dominicans and Haitians to go to war with each other so then they could come in, take the
Mm.
island over, and take whatever was left that the foreign Europeans weren't able to carry out.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so they could miss me with this anti-Haitian stuff. That doesn't mean that I kneel to Haitians or anything like that. They are my equals and I am theirs. There is no superiority or inferiority when it comes to this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you feel about certain Dominicans that center their quote unquote nationalism among racial lines, especially being that DR is such a racially mixed country and all that? How do you feel about that or those individuals?
Well, we're getting ready to take a sledgehammer to their ideology with what
True.
with what we're going to do tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it is ridiculous for
Mm-hmm.
them to assume that true Dominicans are white or unmelanated. I think that that is the absolute most stupidest thing that you could ever say.
Mm-hmm.
It's not based on fact. It is based on heavy revisionism and flat out conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
It is not based on reality. It's based more on myth and the whitewashing of history done primarily by Trujillo. I am not a Trujillista. Trujillo made people that were close to me suffer. Okay, so I would, if let me put it to you this way, I would personally urinate and defecate on Trujillo's bones if I had the chance.
Damn. All right. Okay. It's this is a reoccurring pattern I'm hearing though. Like basically every person that I've interviewed that brings up Trujillo, almost all of them, they're if not them directly, somebody in their family, be it a grandparent, whoever, was negatively impacted by this man. Like almost all of them. It's
I
crazy.
I I could go into stories, but I know that the people that told me certain stories would not want me to. Um, they wouldn't want me to name them because they're all older now and they don't want to be involved in this kind of thing. They don't like this type
Yeah.
of technology. You
Mm,
know how older folks are.
yeah.
But I have met people who have been tortured. I've met people who had their teeth pulled out. I've met people that were interned in La Victoria. They were interned in La Cárcel de la Cuarenta. I've met people that were exiled. So, and somebody very, very, very close to me was him and his family, his side of the family, were made to suffer. Um, things that I don't even really want to get into.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a story about him, about Trujillo. There was some sort of international thing going on, and he was present. So he had on his regalia, so that military style regalia,
Yeah.
the typical of third world dictators. And somebody asked who he was, and a person responded, "Oh, him? He owns a giant farm in the middle of the Caribbean with a bunch of people on it."
A giant farm.
The they did what they were saying was the Dominican Republic was his own private farm, and that
Oh,
the Dominican people were his subjects.
wow.
This is a guy who, for all these nacionalistas de cartón, nacionalistas de hojalata, talk about Trujillo this and Trujillo that. Trujillo tried to make himself bigger than Duarte. There
Mm.
was the famous sign, Dios y Trujillo.
Yeah, I've
He
seen
took
that.
he took away. I still have my mom's visa from when she came to this country. It didn't say Santo Domingo. It said Ciudad Trujillo.
Mm-hmm.
Pico
Wow.
Duarte was renamed Pico Trujillo. So how could we sit here and celebrate this man who tried to co-opt Dominican identity to be his own personal cult of personality?
Right. That you it's so like it's almost like borderline psychotic. Like, damn.
Well, he was most definitely a sociopath.
Jeez. Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, that's crazy. Well, I'm glad that era of history is over. Okay. So we can now get into what we're really, really here for, which is the history here that we're about to really dig into. So as I stated towards the beginning of the interview, we're going to be getting into like the very early colonial history from the late 1400s up until what about the 1800s or the beginning of the 1800s?
I'm gonna cut it off like around 1795.
Okay. Okay.
The reason why is because from 1795 all through the 19th century, so that would be the 1800s, Dominican history is very, very complicated. Um, I wanted to speak a little bit about the Haitian occupation of what would be the Dominican Republic, but that in and of itself, especially with the more I study it, the more people turn me on to different types of information. It's not so clear cut.
Mm.
It's not so clear cut.
Yeah.
So it's a very complex time, and then from that you have the period. See, people get upset with me because I don't really celebrate the 27th of February as independence. I
But you
just
celebrate August.
I celebrate the 16th of August, and I'm gonna explain to you why. The different incarnations of the Dominican Republic has three independence dates. So the first one would be La República de Haití Español. That was founded under what was his name? Ramon. What was that? Ramon Cáceres de Núñez or Núñez de Cáceres.
Núñez de Cáceres, huh?
Okay, Ramon Núñez de Cáceres. That was called La Independencia Efímera, the short-lived independence. So that was after a time when Dominican Republic reverted, because Dominican Republic had felt under French jurisdiction. When Toussaint Louverture marched across that border, he didn't do so as a Haitian the first time. He did it as a general of the French army.
Mm.
He was still representing France. Okay?
Okay.
So this whole República de Haití Español, so reverted back from the French to the Spanish in 1809, and then a period, slavery was reestablished, and then there was a period called La España Boba, the dumb Spain, the stupid Spain. Because Spain, I mean, let's just be honest, they really didn't want us anymore.
Yeah.
They just didn't. They were so consumed with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines and trying to exploit, trying to hold on to what they had there, we were in a state of neglect. Okay.
Yeah.
So when the Independencia Efímera came around, it was only lasted a few months. It was from December to February when, who was it, Boyer? Came through the border. This time they were all Haitians. There was no doubt about that. And the 22-year occupation happened. After that, after the independence of 1844, the so-called independence, which to me was nothing more than a separation, the independence was almost immediately undermined. So you had Pedro Santana y Buenaventura Baez trying to auction off Dominican sovereignty to the highest buyer. Now, people are going to come back and say, "Oh, that's because in order to repel the Haitian attacks." Holy shit! The Americans here were constantly repelling off the British. They didn't sell out to France. They didn't go to France and say, "Hey, France, please come and take us over." You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And when you really get down to the story of Juan Pablo Duarte wasn't even in the Dominican Republic when Moya sounded el trabucazo. He wasn't there. And for all, because Juan Pablo Duarte, el patricio de la patria, el padre de la patria,
Mm-hmm.
it seems that he was never in the Dominican Republic at the time when they needed him the most. Maybe his ideology and his philosophy laid down the groundwork for what would be the Dominican nation, but he wasn't in the Dominican Republic at the time that war broke out. He was
Exiled?
he was exiled. He was
Yeah.
exiled, and he had to be very, very careful coming back. He
Mm-hmm.
came back. He came back later on, but he couldn't stay because Pedro Santana would have killed him.
Wow.
The one thing about Duarte, to differentiate him from the narrative that these fake nationalists want to portray about him, Duarte, as far as I know, was never a white supremacist,
Mm-hmm.
and he was never an imperialist. There's something called Las Cartas Patrióticas de Juan Pablo Duarte, which I think I shared with you.
Mm-hmm.
Juan Pablo Duarte did not want the Dominican Republic to be annexed off to another empire. He was very clear about that. And when Luperón mounted his war of restoration, which to me is the definitive independence, because there was the one that actually became permanent, Duarte was backing him up. In fact, if I remember correctly, Duarte was in the Cibao trying to get guns for him, trying to amass support from him, and Duarte had to leave once again because Santana was gonna kill him.
Mm-hmm.
So when people, I noticed that a lot of these non-white white supremacist nationalists, they like to ensalzar, they like to uplift the image of Pedro Santana. Pedro Santana was one of the most treacherous pieces of shit in the history of the Dominican nation, and to even try to mention him as some sort of celebratory figure is, to me, completely antagonistic to any kind of nationalism that is true and authentic to the Dominican people.
Wow.
After the War of Restoration, basically you had the Dominican Republic fall in a state of disarray. Haiti wasn't really much of a problem anymore because they were dealing with their own shit, and you came into a period of time called where, I don't know if you ever heard the term concho primo or concho primo, concho primismo. Okay, these were ranchers that basically had, it was almost like feudalism. These were ranchers that had their own serfs, so they had like their own basic private armies, their own militias, and they would try to heavily influence who was going to become president of the republic. So if there was a guy that one of the Concho Primos didn't like, they would try to take him out. That's why in that period the Dominican Republic went through so many presidents, because of the political instability.
Okay.
Which ultimately brought us to the occupation of the American occupation in 1915.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the American occupation in 1915. I am a descendant of one of the generals that formed part of a rebel force called Los Caballeros. So I am a direct descendant of one of the generals of that. So this rebelliousness actually flows through my blood.
Mm.
The 1915 occupation of the Dominican Republic, Paraguayo. That's where actually the troops would stick around and watch the Dominican people have parties and fiestas. All right.
Mm.
So when you would see like the Dominican people dance and do all these things, and the military soldiers, the Americans, would just sit there and watch. So they would ask them, well, "What are you doing?" The Dominicans would be like, "What are you?" And the guy, party watching. Party watching became parihuayo.
Wow, really? I didn't know that. Well, I guess that kind of makes sense then, given what Paraguayo means.
Yeah,
I could see some correlation.
yeah.
Mm.
So and then that period brought us to Trujillo dictatorship, which I don't really want to get into now, but we all
Yeah,
know the history of that.
yeah. All right, so now taking it all the way back, we will be using some images, some graphs, okay, in today's interview. So we will begin with the first image, which I'm going to pull up here. All right. So just to give a little overview of what this here is, this is talking about the arrival of Negros Ladinos, who came as early as 1501 or maybe even before that. And these were the first documented Africans to step on what is today Dominican soil. And they would also become cimarrones. So you want to get into this a little bit?
Okay, so we all know the history. The so-called discovered in 1492. They left soldiers at a place called, I think, La Navidad. When Columbus came back, the soldiers were all dead, and he kept moving eastward. I have been told, and I have read, but I can't go by these sources, that Ladinos, and not just Ladinos, but also Moorish Spaniards, were on the boat with Columbus when he arrived on what is today Hispaniola, right? However, the first documented arrival of Africans in what is today the Dominican Republic is right here. On the 3rd of September 1501, the Catholic monarchs gave permission to Nicolás de Obando, who was the first governor of the Spanish colony, to be allowed to import negros ladino, esclavo negro nacido en Castilla. So these were hispanicized and Christianized Africans born on the peninsula, or that have at least been on the peninsula for quite some time.
Okay.
All right. So it says here, eran cristianos y habían asimilado a la cultura española. So they were already assimilated to the Spanish culture.
Mm.
In 1503, though, Obando said, stop bringing these people here. Que no se enviasen esclavos a la española. Do not bring any more of these Ladinos here, because they keep escaping to the montes, to the mountains, to the bush. De tal modo que no podían ser habidos. They couldn't be found. Y que además se establecían entre los indios y le enseñaban malas costumbres. So they would settle with the remaining Taino population, which at this point was getting fully blown decimated.
Mm-hmm.
And they would show them bad customs, these bad habits. What do you think those bad habits were?
Well, how to get away from the Spanish?
Probably how to fight.
Oh, true. Because the Taino were a very non-combative. Well, so, I mean, that's how they describe them, like kind of non-combative, peaceful people.
Yeah, Bartolomé de la Casa, who we're going to get into in a little bit, described them as basically docile. I don't believe that. Okay. I don't believe that, for the simple fact that when Columbus left those Spaniards in that fortification known as La Navidad, when he came back, they were all dead. So what do you think went on there?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So he's saying, these people are escaping. I've said it before and I'll say it again. and we're going to reinforce this later on. The first cimarrones and the first palenques were started in what is today Dominican soil. That should be something taught in every school in the Dominican Republic. That is a point of pride to the Dominican people, the fact that there is rebelliousness and flowing through our veins from the very beginning. From the very beginning, we are not kneeling. We're getting away and we're learning how to fight. Okay. De esto se pueden colegir que ya existían negros esclavos clandestinos, so there were already clandestine black slaves. This was basically the genesis of what is los cimarrones, el cimarronaje in the Caribbean. So what cimarrones, for those that don't know, are the maroons. For people that don't know what that word means, everybody knows what maroons are. Maroons are the escaped slaves that became autonomous and indigenous to the lands in which they inhabited.
Yeah. So now we'll move on to the second here.
Okay.
So in this one, this one is talking about the prohibition of Levantine and Moorish Africans. Okay, this was due most likely to the Inquisition against Jews and Muslims in Spain and their rebellious nature, possibly related to Islamic adherence.
Okay. This is very interesting to me because people don't seem to realize when Columbus was looking for the so-called New World in 1492, the Spanish Inquisition got underway. So the Moors had basically lost control of the Iberian Peninsula and were pushed back into northern Africa and beyond. These Africans that they call Levantine and Moorish were probably most likely Islamic. They were probably Muslim. And they didn't want this influence that they're trying to purge out of Spain to be present in the so-called New World.
Okay.
So that's why it says se prohibió la entrada de negro levantisco y de lo que fueran criados entre Moyos. So those that were raised with the Moors. These slaves, these enslaved Africans, were required to be taken out of the colony and probably out of the peninsula. And if they said here that if they were caught anywhere on the soil, they were going to be subject to $1,000 fine, and debía entonces aplicarse un castigo de 100 azotes, so 100 lashings with a whip. So they really didn't want these people there.
Yeah.
So they really didn't. I put this in because I wanted people to realize that this has a lot of ins and a lot of outs that even I wasn't aware of. So when I was reading through it, being that we were discussing the Moorish influence over the Iberian Peninsula, I thought that this was important to be included because it showed that Spain really was cracking down hard on what was left of the Moors.
Okay.
And the Inquisition started in 1492, give or take, the expulsion of the Jews. Okay. So this, and of certain Muslims. The Moriscos, which were the Spanish descendants of the Moors, didn't get expelled until 1609.
Okay.
So with certain, I want to do a little collab with Truth on that, but there's certain reasons as to why they waited a century later to expel them.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay. All right. This is regarding Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. Are you aware who he was?
Yes. He spoke out against the mistreatment of the Taino, right?
Yes.
Didn't he write like a letter or something about that?
Yes. He wrote several works. So here they're talking about his masterpiece, Historia de las Indias, which was not published until after he died. All right? I think he died somewhere in the 1550s. Can you just scroll down a little bit lower just so I could look at something there real quick? I was turned on to this. I had known about this work, never read it. But people seem to make this argument that the Tainos magically survived the decimation that they faced. I'm not going to say that they didn't fuse into the bloodline. Many of them did, but I don't think it's to the level that some of these anti-black people claim it did. De Las Casas, look at what he's look at the purpose of all the facts he set forth is the exposure of the sin of domination, oppression, injustice that the Europeans was inflicting upon the newly discovered people. It was La Casa's intention to reveal to Spain the reason for the misfortune that would inevitably befall it when it became the object of God's punishment. De La Casas, so I was watching a video where he was brought up. The person mistook what he wrote in Historia de las Indias to be like his last will. It wasn't his last will. It was actually what he wrote in that work. De la Casa said that Spain was going to pay for the basic genocide against the Taino people.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And he went on to describe basically the horrors of what the Spanish did. Now, I know that you have people that are going to turn around and going to say, oh, no, wait a minute, that's all part of the black legend. This is a priest, not that that really has to do anything about it, but this was a priest who chronicled a Spanish priest who chronicles what he saw at that time, where he saw it, which is in what today is the West Indies. Okay, this isn't a black legend, nothing. This is a Spanish priest saying what went down. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about what happened in Mexico or Central America or South America, where the indigenous population had more of a chance of survival because of the overall landmass that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't compare the size of Mexico. How many? Take the whole island of Quisqueya. How many of them could fit in Mexico? How many Cubas could fit in Mexico? How many Puerto Ricos could fit in Mexico? So we're talking about islands that had a very defined size that was not very much. It was very easy to wipe these people out in a very short amount of time. So I don't know what I never really studied what happened elsewhere, but I am going to tell you that in our case, it was a genocide, flat out.
Yeah.
Okay. So he basically is saying, De La Casa is saying the reason why he wrote this is because Spain needed to know the truth. It needed to know the truth of what happened in the West Indies.
Yeah.
Aboga por enviar a dar a conocer a España la verdadera noticia y lumbre de verdad que es el padecimiento, los daños, las calamidades, las despoblaciones de reinos, las injusticias con aquellos indios, los expiables pecados que se han cometido. So he's saying the depopulation, the calamity, the damage, the injustices committed against the indigenous, the unforgivable sins that have been committed against these people. Okay. Somebody had tried to pass off a picture of an Asian Dominican woman as a Taina. That woman, if I'm not mistaken, is actually related to the Eneje family, which is a family of Dominican Taiwanese people.
Oh, really? And they try to pass her off as Taina?
They tried to pass her off. They tried to pass her off as Taina. I'm not gonna say that it's not possible. I'm pretty sure that it is. Okay, she wasn't one of them, and if they do exist, they're very rare.
Yeah.
Okay, again, these people got decimated.
Yeah.
These people got decimated. So I just want to also mention the fact that aside from the abuse and all this, There was a period of time from about 1511 to about 1518 where the population, I mean, it whittled down to about 3,000, I think. It went from 11,000 in like 1511, 1512 to about 3,000. So 8,000 people died because of a smallpox outbreak.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Wait.
Wait. I asked you. I don't know if I was going to cover this. I asked you about Atway if you had covered him in any of
Yeah, I had briefly mentioned him in my video about Anacona. Isn't he the one that ended up? Is he the one that went to Cuba and then later got killed or something?
Yes, yes. That's a
Okay.
depiction of him. That's a depiction of Atway burning at the stake. So
Okay.
Atway is regarded as a Cuban as a Cuban native, as a Cuban indigenous. He was actually ours.
Yeah.
And he fled with, I believe, 400 followers to Cuba to warn the Tainos in Cuba and to tell them to fight back. He was eventually caught and he was burned at the stake. So as the Spanish were getting ready to burn him alive, momento antes de encender el fuego, un sacerdote le ofreció la salvación de su alma. So a Catholic priest offered, while they were getting ready to burn this man, the salvation of his soul, mostrándole la cruz y pidiendo que él aceptara a Jesús para ir al cielo. The priest was showing him the cross and urging him to accept Jesus in order to go to heaven. What was our great Atuay's response? ¿Hay gente como usted en el cielo? Are there people like you in heaven? He asked the priest. Hay mucho como nosotros en el cielo. The priest responds, there's a lot of us in heaven. What did Atuay say? That he did not want to convert and be with people who were so cruel. And he reneged. And he was burned at the stake. This is a part of Cuban history. Cubans claim this, but Atuay was in reality he was from Quisqueya.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm bringing this up again is there's people that they tend to like over romanticize the whole beginning of the Spanish colonial era, and it was anything but. It was at least for us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened in Mexico, Central and South America, but for us, no. There wasn't no romantic about it. There was nothing romantic about it.
Okay.
This is a little conflicting, this piece right here. So this is Los Padres Jerónimo were they were Dominican priests, not Dominican as in the nationality Dominican, but Dominican Catholics.
The Dominican order.
The Dominican order, right.
Okay.
So this little piece right here en carta de 18 de enero de 1518, los padres no solo piden negros. So los padres Jerónimo, these Dominican priests didn't just want more enslaved Africans. They wanted enslaved Africans to be brought in directly from the continent. Now, let's discuss this a little bit. Up until that point, we're led to believe through what I've read that the enslaved Africans that were arriving into the Spanish colony were actually coming from the Iberian Peninsula. In other words, the Iberians, the Spanish and the Portuguese would go to Africa, enslave, bring those slaves up to the Iberian Peninsula, and from the Iberian Peninsula, I guess they would be put up to market, and then they would be brought over to the Spanish colony. Los Padres Jerónimo want to bypass all this, and they just want the enslaved Africans to come directly from the continent to La Hispaniola without going through the middleman of the Iberian Peninsula and be brought directly to market on our soil. So this was called Los Negros bozales, as opposed to Negros ladinos.
Yeah.
Even though by that time the Africans that were coming onto the soil weren't really Ladinos anymore. They were being captured, being brought to Spain, being put to market in Spain, and then being brought over to La Española, to the Spanish colony.
Okay.
So now bozal, basically that word is just to denote that they were taking off directly from the continent. There was no stopping anyplace else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Que vuestra Alteza, His Highness, manda envía facultad para que desde esta isla, what would be the Spanish colony, se arme para ir por ellos a las islas de Cabo Verde y Tierra de Guinea. So what they're saying is they want to send what they were saying is they want to send their own people from the Spanish colony to go get them in Cape Verde, the Cape Verdean Islands, or Guinea, which is on the West African coast.
Yeah.
This is the first slavery insurrection of 1522. Some people say it was in 1521.
So this is like Sebastian Lemba's time, right?
No, this was before Sebastian Lemba.
Oh, this is before that.
Yeah. This is the first major slave insurrection in the so-called New World. Okay. Poco después de la licencia general de la introducción del negro en 1522. So this would have been a couple of years after, in 1522, a couple of years after they started bringing in directly from the continent. There was an insurrection on the plantation of Diego Colón, who was Christopher Columbus's son.
Was this the one that happened like on a Christmas day?
It happened, yes, exactly.
Oh, okay, I've heard of this one. Okay.
I didn't want to get too deep into it because there's so many narratives that describe this really, really well. So I wasn't sure if it was it was best for me to really do a deep dive into it. Okay. But basically, a bunch of Muslim Wolofs. Wolofs come from, at that time, it was called Senegambia. Today, present-day Senegal and the Gambia, which are two separate countries. They were Muslim, and they were enslaved and brought to work on the plantation of the Colón. And I think there was 40 or 50 of them. They would basically form the first insurrection, the first major insurrection. There had been one previous in Puerto Rico in 1515, I believe, but it was quickly quelled. This one was more serious, and let me see. Okay, so he says here, no fue esto un sencillo huirse a los montes. This wasn't a simple, let's just get away, or a simple alzamiento, or just a simple uprising. This was a formal insurrection. So they killed people. They were ultimately caught and they were ultimately killed. But I believe they marched from what would be present-day Santo Domingo. El Río Isabela is one of the rivers that feeds into El Río Ostama that divides the capital. So it's in the northern banks of Santo Domingo, of the capital. They actually marched all the way from that area to Asua, where they were finally caught.
Okay, wow.
And put to death. Continued insurrections involving large numbers of enslaved Africans contributed to the founding of the Palenques, communities of Maroons spreading across the island of so-called La Española. So the reason why I included this is because I wanted you to see that the numbers that were involved in the insurrections, the rebellions that were being, this wasn't like a once in a while thing, these insurrections actually happened more frequently than many people would care to admit. So, los negros de Bauruco no fueron del todo exterminados. So this was a previous uprising that had been quelled. Okay, pues en 1537 se menciona la existencia de un grupo de negros alzados cimarrones, comandado por un líder que respondía al nombre castellano Juan Vaquero. Juan Vaquero was basically another Sebastián Lemba.
Yeah, I think I mentioned his name in my video too. I remember coming across him or his name. Yeah.
So these guys were que andaban por la Sierra del Sur, so they were in the area, the mountainous areas of the south, y asaltaban a los españoles de los alrededores. So they would basically attack the Spanish that were in that area and take their stuff.
Okay.
Okay, these people were surviving in the wilderness. Los alzamientos continuaron sucediéndose durante los años posteriores a esa fecha, que debían haber de 2,000 a 3,000 negros alzados en el Cabo de San Nicolás, en los Ciguayos. Está en la región comprendida entre el río San Juan y Nagua, en la punta de Samaná y en el Cabo de Higüey. So, they're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 Africans up, in arms, rebelling in the eastern portion of the island, in and around the Samaná area.
Okay. Wait, Nagua, that sounds familiar. Wasn't that, Boca de Nagua? Is that it? Boca de Nagua? That's where another big rebellion happened, right?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah. I believe so. This is just giving continuity. Because look at the numbers, 2,000 to 3,000.
Yeah.
So if there's 2,000 to 3,000 roaming around the mountains, how many do you think were enslaved?
Much more than that.
It had to be. It had to be.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you look at this through that lens, you start realizing that, especially in the beginning, the importation of enslaved Africans was huge compared to the so-called white population. And we're going to get into what happened with that white population as time went on.
Okay, so here is where we start to talk about the white Spaniards and them leaving the colony in search of gold in Mexico and South America. The Africans naturally were not allowed to leave and stayed and reproduced.
Yes. La mayor parte de la gente blanca siguió emigrando con mucha mayor intensidad que antes, debido sobre todo a las noticias que llegaban acerca de que en México se había descubierto nueva tierra inmensamente poblada de indios en donde había abundancia de oro. Okay. So, the so-called conquistadors, right? The conquistadors who were busy colonizing got word that in Mexico, which I believe in that point was called Nueva España, there was gold. And it wasn't just in Mexico. They were discovering this in South America as well. So what happened to said conquistadors? They went looking for gold and fortune. Gold and fortune that apparently at this time really wasn't available on our soil. So, tan grave resultó la emigración de gente blanca desde la española que ya en 1598 habían desaparecido 5 pueblos. So it was so bad, the immigration from the Spanish colony, the towns started disappearing.
Wow.
The ones that were left were Concepción, Santiago, Puerto Real, Higüey, Asua, San Juan de la Maguana, Santa Marta del Puerto, Salvatierra de la Sabana y La Yaguana, que apenas reunían entre todos unos 200 vecinos. Okay, so vecinos, the Spanish used the term vecinos, we understand as neighbor.
Yeah.
Vecinos were families.
Okay.
And they usually comprised of about 5 people. So that's why 200 vecinos, que eran unas 1,000 personas. So in the 200 families, there was roughly around 1,000 people. So in those towns that were left, there were only roughly around 1,000 people. Who do you think they were talking about? You think they were talking about everybody counted at once, or you think they were just talking about the whites, the so-called whites? That's a good question. I don't think they were including enslaved Africans in this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely not.
Okay. Además de las 3,000 que aproximadamente había en la ciudad de Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo was founded in 1496. So here we are in the late 1520s, and there was only about 3,000 people in the capital, in what would be the capital of the nation. Okay, not very many. Again, I don't think they're counting the African the African presence. I don't think they're not going to, because it would go against their narrative of what they were trying to establish. So this actually comes from Frank Moya Pons's Manual de Historia Dominicana.
Okay. Okay, so this slide is talking about the importation of enslaved ancestors, Africans, raged through much of the 16th century. It must also be mentioned that unlicensed and unregulated traffic also contributed to the increased African presence on the island.
Yes. So this is Dr. Silvio Torres's. This comes from. I really should have said where I'm getting all this information from. But at the end I will name the sources of where I got this from, all this stuff from. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this is Dr. Silvio Torres. So he's talking about naturally importation of African slaves to Santo Domingo gained momentum with the result of that the black population in the second decade of colonization of the island invariably outnumbered the white, often by a very wide margin. Now, I showed you a clip from a video of a question that I asked one of the elders, who identifies himself as an amateur anthropologist in the Dominican Republic, and he's somebody who I listen to very, very much because he actually is another one who has put in the time and the work researching this stuff. And he made a very good point. I don't know if you remember, where I asked him, were the so-called whites ever a majority during colonization? To which he responded, how could that be possible if in a plantation you had, maybe 10 or 15 whites, but you would have, 30 to 50 Africans. So it makes perfect sense what he was saying. Now, people don't, and I think that this comes up later on. There had to be a formal requisition process in order to continue receiving importation of enslaved Africans. So you had to go through a bureaucracy. So they call that system licencias y asientos. Okay, so every time you wanted to get more enslaved Africans to come into your plantation, you had to go through a bureaucracy in order to get it. However, being that this was a colony that wasn't really regulated to the point that maybe perhaps there was in other places, contraband was very big. It played a role throughout pretty much the first couple hundred years of colonial imperialism, as to where, there was a by the book way of acquiring more enslaved Africans, but a lot of people also just did it, como se dice en español, por la izquierda. They would get it through contraband. So the gap of 1,157 white settlers against 9,648 slaves assessed by a census in 1606. I'm going to say I think it was probably much higher than that on both sides, but I think the ratios probably stayed the same.
Okay.
All right. The numerical disparity would become further accentuated in the extent in which the plantation lost the vitality of its beginnings. The Spanish settlers opted for immigration. Okay, so we're gonna get into that. We're gonna get into what he meant with that.
Okay.
Again, reiterating the numbers.
Okay, so under the plantation system of that era, which revolved around sugarcane production, it didn't take long for whites to be severely outnumbered by the Africans.
Absolutely. Los ingenios eran al mismo tiempo una plantación y una industria. Habían ingenios, como el de Melchor de Torre, que llegaron a tener una población esclava de hasta 900 negros. So what this is establishing is that in the ingenios, which were the sugar mills, they had very large numbers of enslaved Africans. So we're talking about, in this particular case, Melchor de Torres was a Spaniard from I forgot where, and he was a plantation owner. So he had up to 900 Africans on his plantation.
Wow.
Okay, but depending on where you were looking, it says here la población esclava era variable y oscilaba entre los 60, so it could be as low as 60. La cifra mínima, the minimum number, y los 500 en los ingenios más grandes. So depending on the size of the sugar mill, it could have been as low as 60, which would have been the minimum, and it could have been as high as 500.
Mm-hmm.
But as the sugar mills kept increasing, so did the number of enslaved Africans.
Right.
Okay, and Melchor de Castro was another he was another Spaniard. He was from Andalusia, that I know.
Okay.
And he was from Andalusia, and in 1546 he affirmed que los negros debían llegar a 2,000 contra una población blanca que no pasaba más de los 5,000 personas. So in 1546 he affirms that the African population was probably around 12,000 against a so-called white population that would have been around 5,000.
Okay.
So we're seeing that they doubled the white population and then some.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So then in this slide, these are some common names attributed to our African ancestors. These names reflect ethnic groups from West Africa and the Congo. Arara were from Dahomey, present-day Benin and Togo. Lukumi were Yoruba from modern-day Nigeria. Then there's Angola, Longo, Luango, and Congo, which are all derived from the Congo people. Okay, so, and these make up the bulk of our African ancestry.
According to my research, yes.
Okay.
I believe that Dominicans in general, the African ancestry that we inherited. I know it's definitely the case in my ancestry. Congo, sub-Saharan African ancestry derives mostly from the Congo. And when you look, go ahead.
No, that's what I've read too. That when it comes to Dominicans specifically, a big part of our African ancestry comes from the Congo.
Now, when you compare that to Cuba and Puerto Rico, it's very similar. However, being that slavery was ended a lot later in those two colonies, the importation, now it says here Lukumi, the Lukumi, which were the Yorubas, they were brought over, but they came more in massive numbers during the 19th century, so in the 1800s. So especially in Cuba, the Yoruba were the ones that gave rise to what would be commonly called Afro-Cuban Santeria.
Yeah.
The Congos had been there already for a while, but the Lukumis were kind of like in Cuba, especially they were going there bit by bit, but it wasn't really until the 19th century that they started really arriving in mass numbers to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that religion, which I'm a practitioner of, is so strong on Cuban shores.
Yeah. Plus, they arrived into Cuba well into the 19th century, right?
Yeah, because
it makes sense that it's so strong there.
Yeah, I think in Cuba's case, slavery ended in the 1860s. So, and in Puerto Rico, I want to say in the 1870s. Okay. So yeah, they also this is one point that I really need to study more. I have a friend that he really knows a lot about this in the Dominican Republic, but in Cuba they had cabildos with the Afro-Cuban population. Cabildos were these mutual aid societies that were created along the lines of ethnicity. So, in other words, you would have Congos that would make their own cabildos. You would have Lucumí that would make their own cabildos. You would have Arara that would make their own cabildos. You would have the Efik, which later became known as the Abacua, that would have their own cabildos, and they would usually dedicate it to the name of a Catholic saint.
Oh, okay.
Now, I have a friend that he's Dominican that he knows a lot about this because a similar phenomenon happened in the Dominican Republic and what would be today the Dominican Republic, but I don't have all the information, but he does. He really studied that hard, and he's actually a member of instead of calling them cabildos, they call him in the Dominican Republic, it was called cofradías.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. And so now we get to the point where the mulatto class really started to rise in Santo Domingo, and so did different names regarding their racial admixtures to distinguish and create a racialized caste system. And so this is what this paragraph here kind of talks about.
Hacia racial division. La población de color está dividida en negro esclavo y libre. So the first demarcation would have been between enslaved Africans and free Africans.
Mm-hmm.
But then you start getting into, well, quote unquote, black and mulatto. And out of those blacks and mulattoes, you would have what would be called here quatroons.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is actually pretty typical reflection of Spanish society. So it would, and not just Spanish, because the French did this too. So the mestizaje started becoming a point of division, and I don't know if I should say it, maybe privilege, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I'm, huh?
I would say there probably was a certain level of it to the people, like the more I guess European they were in their admixture.
Right.
So once you go from mulatto to quadroon to octoroon, whatever, I'm sure the privilege kind of rose.
Well, here's something that's really interesting. Mestizos son los provenientes de personas cuarteronas y blancas, so a quatroon and a white, reputándose los hijos de mestizos como personas blancas o como persona blanca. Es decir, que tercerones son los nietos de... Okay, I'm really convinced at this point that a lot of the so-called whites weren't really white.
Yeah, that's the conclusion I began to come to also, like in my own research. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think there were I've mentioned before, I don't know what video, that there were various accounts, like once the French colony was established, a Frenchman that went to Santo Domingo, and they themselves observed that these so-called white people, they weren't really fully white. Like you could tell that they had some type of admixture in them.
There was one French chronicler who described, this is at the time of the French colony, mm-hmm. and when he went to the Spanish side, he thought that the whites were the majority. And it was called into question. An Englishman, also a chronicler, went into the Spanish colony and said that he observed it like this: 15,000 so-called white, 15,000 black, and his number was 73,000 mulattoes.
Wow.
How he arrived at those numbers, I don't know. But I could see how looks could be deceiving.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, because we're so heavily mixed.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering, how did they like calculate, or how did they do the census back then? How did they get to these conclusions of, oh, there's this many thousand of this group and this many thousand of that group? Like, how did they do it?
They probably scattered throughout the whole island. They probably had officials scattered throughout the whole island, and they would be. They probably knew where everybody was put because they had everybody registered.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So they probably came up with it, but again, they're not counting the escaped cimarrones because they have to be taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be taken into account. But I believe that's the way they probably did it.
Okay. So the colonial plantation economy began to slow down dramatically, leading to less importation of enslaved ancestors. However, slavery remained intact.
Yeah. By this time, the colony started to implode economically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So exploitation was basically waning out. Sugarcane was no longer bringing in the money that it once did. And I was reading that, I didn't put it in here, but I was reading that the enslaved actually became master sugarcane producers. Not just the cutting of the cane, but the actual extraction in the trapiches and the converting in the sugars into in the ingenios. They became experts in this field.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery did remain intact. It says here, parece que en los últimos años, parece que en los últimos esclavos negros introducidos durante el siglo XVI fueron introducidos en 1597. So in 1597, it appears that this was the last shipment of the century.
Mm-hmm.
1,005 years for the labor of the mines, to go labor in the mines.
Mm-hmm.
In 1599, 100 para la construcción. So 100 more in 1599 for the construction of a church. One
Okay.
thing I always called into question, if I said before, Santo Domingo, and this is common fact, was founded in 1496. Who built it? Who built La Catedral Primada de América, the first cathedral? Who built it?
Yeah, who did build this?
I mean, we could say the natives, but I mean, they didn't seem. Just to revisit Bartolomé de las Casas, he was for the enslavement of the Africans.
Yeah.
Because his argument was the indigenous were too weak.
Yeah.
The Tainos were too weak
Mm-hmm.
to do the labor. So what was founded in the, go ahead.
Because the very first shipments of enslaved Africans didn't happen until 1501, right? Supposedly.
Supposedly.
Hmm. So so you don't think the Spanish would have built it themselves?
Maybe some of it.
That's a good question.
That's a very good question. Being that they seem to be already dependent, or I mean, not dependent, but to seem that they already had ladinos on the peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of leads credence to the theory that they were on the boat or boats.
Yeah. It's not too far-fetched. It could be right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now, even though the colonies struggled economically in the beginning of the 17th century, the demand for imported forced labor from Africa started to grow once again.
Okay. All right. So we talked about how the latter part of the 16th century saw an end to the sugarcane plantation system.
Mm-hmm.
In your studies, have you ever came across what took place of it economically? What came after?
Not specifically. I mean, from what I've researched, I didn't get this into detail. All I know is that I believe it was, I guess, in the 1600s or maybe beginning of the 1700s. I know that I read that the economy really plummeted, and that had a lot to do with why the sugar industry also kind of plummeted in Santo Domingo. And I remember reading it, and I got to the point that they were trying to asked the Spanish crown for a line of credit to get more slaves. But anyway, in the process of all that, that is why it eventually ended up turning into cattle ranching versus sugar plantation. That
You
is
got
just
it.
a general idea of what I've researched.
You got it.
Okay.
No, you got it. You got it. Los ateros, el hato, la ganadería. So we're talking about cattle ranching. Now,
Okay.
yeah, you got it. Cattle ranching, agriculture, what is commonly called today el sector agropecuario. So farming and animals. Okay. So en 1698 parece había apremio de esclavos en la colonia. So Governor Chavez Osorio was starting to ask the crown to start bringing more enslaved Africans onto the territory, con la condición de que los vecinos pagaran al asentista el valor de cada negro. So to pay the value of each quote unquote black to come and cultivate the land. Also, Jerónimo de Alcócer, who was and I believe another chronicler in su Relación Sumaria, which was his work, they were uh, they were mining silver in Jarabacoa, and they had to abandon it, abandonarse por falta de esclavos, because they didn't have any slaves. They didn't have any enslaved Africans to work the silver mines. So in Jarabacoa, so they had to abandon them.
Mm-hmm.
So because you got to understand, as you keep settling the land, or resettling in some cases, because sometimes you settle it, it doesn't work out, you go back to where you came from, then you try to resettle it again, you start discovering new things. You start discovering new minerals and so on and so forth, and then you start expanding on the agriculture. So what's going on here is that Chavez Osorio is saying, listen, we need more people. We need you to send more Africans, because we're once again exploiting the land, and we also got some mines that need to be taken care of.
Mm-hmm. And by this time,
go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off, but and also I think by this time, the number of free blacks also began to even outnumber the amounts of enslaved blacks. Or was that in the following century? Am I getting ahead of myself?
No, it's actually
already happening by now.
Very interesting that you mentioned that, because I should have mentioned this before. Do you know why there was a free class that was starting to rise up?
Not exactly, no.
So in the last part, we said that in the last part of the 16th century, sugarcane started to plummet. What do you think was going on with all the enslaved Africans?
Well, I guess they were being set free, right? Since there was no need. Yeah. Since they weren't working at sugar mills anymore.
You got it. So this basically laid the foundation, los cimientos, of a free black and mulatto class. Some of them, a lot of them were able to buy their freedom. However, unlike the whites, generally they weren't allowed to leave. This represents when the island was one. One colony under one foreign empire, colonized all at once.
Okay.
So, en este mapa, this comes from Juan Bosch's Composición Social Dominicana, where he talks about the purposeful depopulation that happened in the early 1600s. Now, what was going? Remember, Juan Bosch calls the 1600s el siglo de la miseria. Okay. This is Spain was dealing the century of misery. Spain was dealing with other things, and at this point, we were in a state of neglect. So, not to mention that we were well into the privateer, bucanero, buccaneer, the piracy.
Mm-hmm.
And you also had other foreign colonizers looking to get a piece of the action. So these were the towns. You had La Yaguana, you had Bayaja, Montecristi was still. I mean, now it, but at that time, it says here, ciudades destruidas. So these cities were devastated, and they were purposely depopulated, and the population was more centered on the eastern, not just the eastern, but the real eastern portion of the island.
Mm-hmm.
Ok, so en este mapa, sí, antes de que se llevaran a cabo de los años, las despoblaciones de Osorio. So we talked about Osorio. He was the one that was asking for more enslaved.
Uh-huh.
And ustedes tenían la escala de ubicación. So you could see how these cities were, how the island at this point was under one jurisdiction
Mm-hmm.
during the early phase of colonization.
Okay, and so the towns that are colored in black, ciudades destruidas. So those cities were what? Okay, well, destroyed. So like, what, they were just depopulated or abandoned.
Well, my understanding is if you see, especially the ones on the coast, were subject to attack.
Okay.
So um, I don't remember off the top of my head if they purposely destroyed it or if they were destroyed in attacks. I know that La Yaguana was under constant. They couldn't. I mean, if you look at the overall geography of the island, it's got a weird geography to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they just didn't have the personnel
Yeah.
because we were in a state of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
They just did not have the personnel to defend the island. And as a society, we were on a downturn, and a really bad downturn. So basically, this is cutting your losses and um, trying to redirect your resources to where you could actually handle a scale which you can have a functioning colony. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, this was great for the cimarrones.
Mm.
This worked out really well for them.
Yeah. I bet.
They could start now going further west and be left alone
Yeah.
for the most part.
Interesting. Okay, so we have here another picture.
Okay, las ciudades de Bayaguana y Monteplata fueron formadas con los habitantes de Bayaja y La Yaguana. Okay, so the cities that we had before that were devastated, destroyed, depopulated,
Mm-hmm.
those inhabitants founded Monteplata, which we all know, north of the capital, and
Mm-hmm.
Bayaguana.
Okay.
So the inhabitants of those areas founded these two new pueblos.
Okay. Gotcha.
This is where shit starts getting good. All right. Okay. So what do you think happens when you get wind that Spain can no longer control its first colony, the entirety of its first colony, and that the whole western side of the island is now depopulated? What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, people was like, "Oh, we about to get our foot in there."
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. It was like we
So,
about to take advantage of that.
yeah, so the British and the French that were in St. Kitts, um, Martinica, the Leeward Islands,
Mm-hmm.
they were like, "Oh fuck, we're in like Flint, man," and they started. This became basically a haven for pirates. So
Yeah.
when you watch the movie with Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean, and they talk about Tortuga,
Mm-hmm.
Tortuga is, if I'm not mistaken, that little island right on the north of the peninsula in the north of what would be Haiti. That
Uh-huh.
little island that's on that coast,
Yeah.
that, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's Tortuga.
Okay.
So it was a complete bullshit, that movie.
Wow.
The pirates really had a field day, especially the French privateers.
Uh-huh.
They had a field day with this. They
Wow.
started basically setting up shop. That's how France really started getting its foot in the door
Mm-hmm.
into the western portion of the island. It
Yeah.
basically, as far as I'm concerned, it was through the pirates.
Yo, that's crazy. Wow.
The reason why I included this. This is from Milagro Ricul's work. Name of the book: The Dominican Racial Imaginary. The false narratives that are being portrayed on the Dominican people are just that. They're false. There have been historians that, so-called Dominican historians, that try to blame the decline of the Spanish the colony and our negritude on the French,
Mm-hmm.
on the pirates, and everything, and the Haitian Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what it says here. The creation of the French colony, the Haitian Revolution, and the resultant shame of negritude that sullied the purity of Dominican blood. Where have we heard that before? Right?
Mm.
These authors do not acknowledge that by the, next slide, beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish colony was already predominantly black and mulatto.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say to you?
Yeah. And see, and this is what always trips me up when I hear some of these people talk about how we were mainly white with like a speck of black until the Haitian Revolution. I'm like, okay, y'all clearly have not studied the history. You haven't looked at the graphs. I mean, even you can do a quick Google search, just like I have done in the past, and look at the census information from before the Haitian Revolution or they took over the island, all of that. It's very clearly right there. It depicts that the black and mulatto / free blacks, they're grouped together. They clearly outnumber the number of the whites. Like, that, I mean, that's just a fact. Like, I don't understand where the people, again, they get this idea that it was predominantly white. It has been this way. It's been like this, mainly black and mulatto from the very beginning.
That's what I'm proving.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's what you've been proving.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about anybody else in the community, how far they wanted to take it. I'm trying to take it to the end so people can see. Hopefully, I know the radicalized people, the extremists, they're not going to care.
Yeah.
They're not going to care.
You can get them all, they're still going to continue with the bullshit.
Yeah, they're still going to continue with that bullshit. They're still going to try to portray the society and themselves as something they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way I continue saying that our blackness comes from Haitians and it comes from Cocolos and it comes from this and from that. And yeah.
So it wouldn't it be funny, because I always thought about this. If you're obviously a mixed race mulatto, to put it nicely,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying that your African ancestry comes from Haiti, and you're anti-Haitian, are you anti yourself?
Mm. Yeah.
So that means that you're part Haitian, if that's true.
Yeah, that's basically what these idiots are saying. Yeah. What's so funny about it?
So
As the French colony began to assert its economic engine, powered by the massive influx of enslaved Africans, Spanish authorities began importing families from the Canary Islands to reinforce Spanish influence in Santo Domingo. They were given land and resources, and these families took hold primarily in the Cibao, according to what you have researched.
yes. Okay. So la frontera entre las colonias. So now you had, okay, so a little backstory here. France started basically taking over in 1640. However, the jurisdiction of the entire island still belonged to Spain. As the French began colonizing, the Spanish and the colonials simply didn't have, as we discussed before, the manpower and probably not even the will to try to do anything about it. So
Mm.
boundaries obviously were set. Now, this is something that's something very interesting happens. They decide that they want to start importing people from the Canary Islands. They want to start importing families, right? So
Okay.
they were having border disputes. That's why la lucha por las tierras del oeste fue una lucha de intereses encontrados entre dos sociedades y entre dos economías. Okay, so you have a struggle for land on both sides that's centered around two societies, two different societies, one being French and one being Spanish, who were arch enemies of each other, and two different types of economies. Well, what kind of economies? Fue una pugna entre la plantación y el hato. So it was a dispute between the plantation and the ranch.
Mm.
The French, you were using the plantation, and the ranchers were being used on the Spanish side.
Mm-hmm.
Entre el capitalismo colonial francés, so French colonial capitalism, y el sistema tradicional de explotación de la tierra españolas. So basically serfdom, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
had a dispute between a capitalist enterprise that the French were carrying out through their plantation economy, while the Spanish were exploiting the land in what would be a ranching economy.
Okay.
So, in order to reinforce la nacionalidad española, as it says here in the paragraph, la pugna fronteriza fueron pugnas por la preservación de la nacionalidad española en las tierras de Santo Domingo. So, these disputes on the border were disputes that that the colonials were looking to aim, the Spanish colonials, in order to preserve their Spanish identity. I'm throwing red meat to these people, to these so-called nationalists with this. But we're gonna find out a little something as the time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So they started bringing in people from the Canary Islands in the late 1600s in order to give them land along the border and reinforce the Spanish identity of our side of the island.
Mm.
So it says here the importation of these families started in 1684. In between 1684 and 1691, they were introduced in Santo Domingo 323 families that uh, totaled around 1,615 individuals.
Okay.
So we had a little bit of an influx
Uh-huh.
in a space of 7-8 years of about 1,600 individuals.
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot. No. But hey, they're there. However, these. Let's move to the next slide, and I'll further elaborate.
Okay.
Okay. Como los vecinos y el gobernador de Santo Domingo percibían directamente esta. Okay, so what happened was these over 1,000 of them came in the late 1600s, but they stopped. They stopped because again there was difficulty, and this wasn't the only colony that I guess was in need of this type of thing, right? Because it says here, el rey decretó ese mismo año que los armadores de barco de la isla Canaria debían enviar unos periódicamente a Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico y Caracas. For those that don't know, Puerto Rico and Venezuela have a lot of Canarian ancestry.
Yeah.
A lot. And at the end of that first paragraph, al llegar a su destino, se le daría tierras, ganados y semillas. So when they got to their destination, they would be giving land, livestock, and seeds. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think was doing the work?
Mm. The black people.
You goddamn right.
Yeah.
And I'll prove that in a second. Así en 1720 llegaron las primeras. So in 1720, they picked up again doing this. They started bringing back more people from the Canary Islands. This time it was 50 families that came. 50 families in 1720, and in 1725 another 28 families. So 5-person each family. So we're looking at maybe 600-700 people. I don't know, my math may be off. So these people were supposed to go to the border. They didn't stay there. For whatever, I
Mm.
don't. From my reading and my research, when people talk about the light-skinned Dominicans in El Cibao, many of them, if not almost all of them, are the descendants of these Canarians.
Okay.
Because that's really where they took root.
Okay.
Now, we would find out later on that they would also go through admixture themselves. In fact, if they were Canarian, they were probably already mixed with the Guanche,
Mm-hmm.
because especially at that time, where they were less mixed, they were more mixing within each other. So the Spanish conquered the Canary Islands in the 1440s, I want to say. So from the 1440s to about 300 years, they had their own admixture coming in. So they,
Mm-hmm.
again, they looked white, but they had admixture as well, which
Yeah.
probably expressed themselves differently through their descendants, especially when they started mixing with the black and mulatto population.
Right.
Okay. So they were trying to populate Montecristi, Samana, to try to stop French influence on the island.
Mm.
Um, so they were given privilege. But again, who do you think they were taking with them to do the work?
The black
That's
people.
the black people,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the arrival of Canarios paled in comparison to the continued importation, both licensed and unlicensed, of Africans. It continues to be noted that enslaved ancestors in the form of contraband made up a huge portion of these Africans. Also, the Spanish purchased Africans from the French colony in exchange for goods.
So they were importing the Canarians, right? However, let's take a look at what was going on. They still needed, quote unquote, black people to do this. We spoke about the Spanish crown also granted permissions in the form of licencias or asientos. So that
Mm-hmm.
was the bureaucracy that you had to go through in order to continue receiving enslaved Africans, correct? So you had these trading companies that supplied it. In the beginning, it was the French and the English, but um, but then it just mainly became. Oh no, I'm sorry. In the beginning, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese. Then, as time went on, the French were the ones who really took over the trade
Okay.
of Africans.
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish colony also obtained enslaved workers locally from the island's French territory. Okay.
Mm.
Although runaways from the French areas were apprehended by Spanish authorities, the main avenue was commercial exchanges, where the Spanish offered cattle, meat, and hides as payment for human and other commodities. So think
Wow.
about this. These are the Spanish gods that are so revered by the repentant mulattoes who claim Spanish and Spain. But it was Spain, it was their Spanish gods that were running to the French colony to ask for more enslaved African black people.
You know, it's kind of funny how history kind of repeats itself. Because as you're saying this, I'm thinking of how in the present day, Dominicans are still getting Haitians to work for them, and the Dominican side.
You know what's the funny thing is,
Wow.
if you get rid of every single Haitian now, who's going to do the work? The excuse that I always hear is that, oh, if you pay a decent wage, the Dominicans will do it. Perhaps that's true. I'm not going to badmouth my own people, and
Yeah.
I've met plenty of Dominicans that love to work the land. But is it on the scale that they've gotten used to with Haitian workers?
Mm.
Okay, let's read a little bit further into this. In addition, the Spanish government granted permission to Spanish privateers, pirates, to capture ships of enemy nations. Ships of what? Reports and letters dating from 1739 to 1765 indicate that several Spanish privateers brought hundreds of enslaved Africans seized from English ships into the colony.
Oh wow.
Hundreds more were purchased with licenses from the Spanish governor in Caribbean ports that included St. Eustatius, Barbados, Veracruz, and St. Vincent. However, the largest number of enslaved workers was smuggled onto the island by unlicensed Spanish, Dutch, English, and French privateers. One
Mm.
approximation of the magnitude of this smuggled human cargo is provided by the result of amnesty granted to the Spanish crown in 1756 and executed by Governor Jose Solano y Bote in 1776. In consequence, I didn't include the next page. In
Okay.
consequence, a total more of 1,100 enslaved Africans were brought in that instance.
Wow.
And they were caught and they were given amnesty.
Hmm.
So, again, they're trying to bring in these Canarians, throwing red meat to the so-called fake nationalists. Oh, look, Canarians! But who else were they bringing in? And
And
on
in
what
larger
scale?
numbers.
Yeah, hand over foot.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Dominican Blackness cannot be blamed on the French colony and the subsequent founding of Haiti. The black and mulatto population continuously outpaced that of the so-called whites. Afro-Spanish admixture is a defining element in Dominican racial identity with a strong presence of overall African ancestry.
The evolution of the population of the Spanish colony of Hispaniola. In tracing the second paragraph, in tracing the colony's population growth over its first century and a half, the official Dominican imaginaries culprits of negritude, the French colony, Haiti, were both not even in existence, so therefore they are exonerated. Neither privateers on Tortuga, the French sugar colony, nor the Republic of Haiti was responsible for the overwhelming majority of mulatto and blacks then or for their descendants in the present day Dominican Republic. Africans were on the island at the beginning of colonization. By the end of the 16th century, the colonial racial profile had revealed ethnic and racial mixing and substantial additional numbers of African maroons sustaining themselves in the island's wilderness. Moreover, many more Africans would arrive during the 18th century, contributing a further infusion of blackness into the colony's racial panorama.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's right there.
Now, people are going to say just because it's written in the book doesn't mean it's true. This lady studied in Santo Domingo. She is a Dominican, and her book is full. In fact, the main book that I used for this, she cites a lot. That guy who wrote that book, which I'll go over my sources at the end, um, worked with Franklin Franco, who wrote the book that's Blacks, Mulattoes, and the Dominican Nation. That's never been out of print. It's always getting the latest edition revision, not revision, revised.
Mm.
So it's always in print.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is whether you like it or not, whether you hate it or not, whether you accept it or not. Fact.
Yeah. Okay, and so here is the actual breakdown from 1492 to 1796. Okay.
So you could take a look at that and tell me what you think.
Yeah, so well, I mean that's insane. I mean, how the number of the natives, the Tainos, went down literally to zero. Wow.
I'm gonna tell you my feeling on this. I think this graph, I dispute the numbers on this as well. I
Mm.
think the numbers were a lot more on everybody's end, but
Okay.
I think the proportions were on point.
Mm-hmm.
Those I wouldn't change. So you're looking at 1794. I mean, the Aborigines, the native Tainos, I believe there were a lot more than 100,000 on that island. I think they were probably around 500,000.
Okay.
But they just didn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
And while they do live within our DNA, we're not on the level of like a Mexico or said South American country as far as the higher levels of native admixture. So
I'm just wondering, how did the population drop so much between 1542 and 1606?
people were leaving.
But like the number of blacks dropped too. Like, how did that happen?
Maybe. Oh, they also. I was reading that they also went through diseases.
Oh,
They
really?
they also. Yeah, I was reading about that. They also had like small. They were dying, and in fact, what was it? What was it that I read? I read. I didn't include it in this. That when they first started bringing los negros bozales, not just los negros bozales, even when they were bringing them from the peninsula, not the ladinos, the ones that they would put to market from the continent in the in the Iberian Peninsula. So the
Uh-huh.
ones that they would go take from the continent, go to the Iberian Peninsula, put them for market, and then transfer them to the so-called New World. They were
Mm-hmm.
dying in droves, especially in the beginning, because they were not used to the transportation, and I don't think the colonizers had any idea what they were doing when they started transporting massive amounts of numbers. So if you tried to bring in a boatload of maybe 1,000, you
Mm-hmm.
understand, with the conditions that you had them subjected to, I have no doubt in my mind that instantly, on that, what was that, a month that it took to cross the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
they would have died. A couple of hundred probably would have died, and then you bring them into a land whose flora and fauna they might have been used to,
Mm-hmm.
because it might have been similar to what the environment that they came from, but now they're dealing with people who are, coughing on them, raping them, spraying their germs to them, and they're probably not. Their immune system probably didn't hold up.
Mm.
I mean, they fared better because the numbers sustained that they fared better, but they
Yeah.
probably, especially early on, they just probably didn't make it. And I read that one of the Spanish, uh, I don't remember if it was in the Iberian Peninsula or if it was in Spain or if it was in the Dominican Republic. It was like, yo, you got to take care of the merchandise.
Mm.
These, they're dying. Like, if you want, I'll look for it later on and I'll send it to you on the site so you can take a look at it. But he was like, "Yo, these people are dying. Stop!" Because they're not looking at it from a humane point of view. They're looking at it as, "Yo, they die. We're losing money."
Right. So basically, within a span of 200 years, roughly, so from 1606 to 1794, well, the numbers did grow substantially, but I mean, you see the number of whites to enslaved to free, they're all almost neck to neck. They're very close, with the number of
Yeah,
free people being the largest population.
right. So I mean, the whole point of this is if you combine the enslaved and the free, they're outnumbering the so-called Spanish whites
Yeah,
by about a 2-to-1 margin.
right. Yeah.
And I want to say that as I was reading Composición Social Dominicana, Cuba had around this time period roughly the same numbers. I think Cuba had maybe about 20 to 30,000 more people in it. But
Okay.
I don't see that as being a major difference between, especially since, you know, our situation, we were cut in half basically by this point. You feel me? The Western, by 1794, the Western portion of the, I mean, this was what uh, uh, right before the Haitian, or I think maybe even the Haitian Revolution might have already started. I think it started in 1791. So our population was as low as it was, but I still believe that the numbers were higher. But I think the proportions were the same.
Mm-hmm.
But Cuba, from what I remember, because Juan Bush does go into it, was about maybe 20 to 30,000 more around the same time period as this.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, so the fusion of the races, cementing the legacy of African admixture in Santo Domingo.
Okay. Desde un principio, los blancos tienen hijos con las mujeres negras. Fenómeno muy general, unas veces sin establecimiento de otro nexo de otro nexo que es el carnal. So what that means is basically, from the beginning, the whites, the so-called whites, would have children with the black woman, and this was basically not because of love, but because this was what they basically is a nice way of saying rape. Unas veces sin establecimiento de otro nexo que es el carnal. Carnal, carnal lineage. The carnal, like carnal sin. Otra, estableciéndose estable concubinato. And other times, actually having a stable, not so much marriage, but a concubine.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw this in this country. So you had the slave master who had his wife, but he would rape the slave woman, almost always the one who worked in the kitchen, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and he would have children, and the slave mistress would let that go. They wouldn't do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
There was a period where the Spanish tried enslaving their women to send to the Spanish colony
Mm.
for what they called domestic work.
Really?
Las esclavas blancas.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
They tried, didn't really work out
Mm-hmm.
because the men were complaining that they just were not up to task. So
Wow.
it was a very short-lived practice that happened in the 1510s, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, so I was like real early on.
Real early on, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, los blancos. Next slide.
Oh.
Thank you. También se unen a las mujeres mulatas. So you have this. So whites would also go after the mixed race mulata women, or los mulatos con mujeres blancas, or mulatto men with white women. A veces estas relaciones son amparadas por la iglesia celebrándose correcto matrimonios velados. Sometimes the church would officially celebrate these unions. La mezcla se suceden entre blanco y mulato. So you had the mixture that would happen between white and mulatto,
Mm-hmm.
mulatto and mulatto,
Mm-hmm.
mulatto and black, and even mulatto and Indian.
Mm-hmm.
De modo que bien pronto existió en Santo Domingo una verdadera fusión racial. That as soon as Santo Domingo was a thing, the races were already starting to mix. Ya hemos visto en otro lugar que los hijos de mulato y blanco llamáronse tercerones. So we're going back into the racial names.
Yeah.
Lo de esto y blanco, cuarterones, mestizo, comprendió a todo individuo hijo de cuarterón, excuse me. pero se conocieron otras designaciones, así como llamáronse grifos a los hijos de negros y mulatos, sobre todo si tenían la piel negra. So if you had a mixed-race woman or a mixed-race man who got with a, I guess, a purer African, that product, especially if they were dark-skinned, was called a grifo. Okay. A los hijos de negro y de indio le llamaron alcatraz. We in other parts it was called a sambo.
Yeah,
So
sambo.
The children of black and Indian in that time was also called Alcatraz or Alcatraz. Tenemos constancia documental, aunque algo tardía, de esta última especie de uniones con el matrimonio de individuos llamados Pedro Manuel Ortiz. So they're giving you an example of the indigenous and the black. So here's a guy named Pedro Manuel Ortiz, a free black man, who was from Guinea, from the west coast of Africa, and Luisa Ortiz, India, natural de Moya, a quienes nació un hijo que fue bautizado en la ciudad de Santo Domingo el 25 de abril 1761. So they give you an example of a black and indigenous. As late as 1761, she was probably mixed. Because I seriously doubt she was a full-blooded Taina woman.
Yeah.
Or she might, listen to this, she might not have been Dominican. You know why I say that? Because there was still a lot of moving around, and sometimes people, the so-called white, let's say things weren't working out for him in what would become Guatemala. So he would take what he considered to be his property someplace else. Inside that property, they would have been natives. You understand? Pedro Santana, who I told you before I fucking despise, his mother was a Mexican indigenous woman.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
His father was a Canario, but his mother was a Mexican indigenous woman.
Wow.
Okay. The last paragraph is very important. Por la fuerza de la sangre, pues la raza negra se vincula a la familia dominicana. Por los nexos del trabajo y del cristianismo se vincula a la sociedad. Por el lazo de sus ideales de libertad se vincula a la historia patria.
Wow.
So, by the force of blood, or forged in blood, the black race is connected to the Dominican family. Through the connections of, or through the nexo, what would be a good word for in English for that? Not connections, through the ties, there we go. Through the ties of work and Christianism, or Christianity, it is connected to the society. So remember, this was a Catholic society that celebrated its Christian religion, right? So what it's saying is that the African integrated himself through his work, more often than not forced labor, and through the acceptance of Christianity into society. Y por el lazo de sus ideales de libertad, and for his ideals of liberty, from the black man's ideals of liberty, the rebellions, the cimarronaje, the maroons, the constant yearning to be free. The African is connected to the Historia Patria, the history, our history of our land.
Wow. That's beautiful. No matter how you put it, I mean, there's just no way to take away that African component of our heritage, of our history, of our ancestry, of who we are as Dominicans. It's just so intertwined into who we are and our identity. And I mean, everything that we just covered proves that.
I knew that this story had to be brought out. I knew that there's people probably much more better equipped than me to do this. There have been people better with more knowledge than me, with university degrees and stuff, that could have done a much better job of bringing this out. I decided that this was going to be my contribution to the Dominican people on your platform. I
Well,
know that you
thank you.
you're welcome, but thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity and this privilege to be on here and to show our history.
Yeah.
One of the most important roots of our history. I know there are going to be people that are going to try to disparage this, but we all know what we saw. I stand by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think you did an awesome job. I mean, just the amount of time and effort, I mean, getting every single picture, putting all this information together, compiling this little outline that you made for me. I mean, this took a lot of work on your part. So don't like belittle what you just did. I mean, this was a lot of information. You just compiled 300 years or so of history into what, 2 hours and some change. So I think
Yeah,
you did an awesome job.
I
Yeah.
appreciate it. I
Yeah.
didn't. I could have, obviously I could have gone a lot deeper, but then again, we would be here forever. I mean, this the first 300 years of colonization was, it was a very complex time, and when you compare it to Puerto Rico and Cuba, we went through and I'm speaking as a Dominican nationalist, we went through a very unique experience, I feel,
Mm-hmm.
um, where Puerto Rico and Cuba remained Spanish colonies throughout almost into the 20th century, give or
Yeah.
take.
Mm-hmm.
We had a different trajectory.
Right.
We had a different outcome, and we tried. We tried the first time against Spain. Then we succeeded against Haiti, only to have the distinction of being the only colony to revert back to colonial status after achieving independence twice. Not just
Yeah.
once, twice. Because people want to sit there and they want to discount La República de Haití Español, but it was still an independence.
Yeah. Short lived, but it still counts.
It's still there, you know.
Mhm.
And the separation from Haiti, and again, I will always call it that because it was automatically socavado, undermined by a couple of people. Well, not a couple. I mean, a couple of people and their followers who chose to try to hide behind the skirt of another empire in order and to go against the ideals of Juan Pablo Duarte, who everybody credits as el padre de la patria. These men betrayed Duarte. They betrayed him, and they left him to die alone, because I understand that he was alone in Venezuela.
Yeah.
They betrayed him. And it seems, and not that it seems, it is absolutely atrocious and vile that today's so-called Dominican nationalists on one hand, will champion Duarte and make him out to be something that he most certainly wasn't, and glorify the people who would have killed him if they had the chance. In Pedro Santana. And there's no chance if Trujillo and Duarte ever met, Trujillo would have had him killed. Because for Trujillo, there was only room for one person, Trujillo.
Right. Yeah. Again, I really thank you for taking the time to give us this history lesson. Like I said at the beginning of the video, for whatever reason, these first 300 years of Dominican history tends to get very glossed over. We tend to just focus on the separation from Haiti and forward, and we don't really take the time to dig into this particular history, which really, I mean, at the end of the day, it set the foundation for the nation that we would become, the people that we would become. This set the tone for the society, for the racial mixture component of who we are. I mean, everything. It all goes back to this time period here. So I think it's really important, and for Dominicans especially, to know this information, and just to know the facts, so that they're not getting so easily swayed by some of these people out here that are just trying to push certain narratives and don't really have any historical backing, and they don't know what the hell they're talking about.
I don't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you can go.
What they're actually doing is they're punking Spain. I have no issue celebrating the Spanish influence. None.
Right. Yeah, same here.
People will take exception to that. But I have no issue, even though I'm discovering that my Spanish ancestors weren't so Spanish. I speak Spanish. I fully am aware that we have inherited certain Spanish customs and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
What these people are doing is they're actually making the Spanish influence to be more rancid than anything else, to be weaponized against the reality that we as Dominicans have a very serious African admixture, that it's evident in everything that we do.
Yeah.
From the way that we look, to the way that we speak Spanish, to the way that we interact, it's there.
Yeah.
So why is this such a problem? And what they're doing is they're making people like me rebel even more against the European influence. Because if you're gonna go come after a portion of my ancestry that I hold sacred, I hold all of it sacred. But there's just something about Dominican Blackness that I just cherish. Okay?
Yeah.
And these people want to come and talk their bullshit looking the way that they do.
Yeah.
I didn't really need to go through this. All I had to do to destroy their narrative is hold up a mirror to their face.
Yeah.
Quickly, I'm just gonna say the sources that I used so people could look them up on their own. I called this little presentation "The African Origins of Dominican Identity, Art, Understanding, or Racial Reality." Sources used: Los Negros y la Esclavitud en Santo Domingo by Carlos Larrazabal Blanco, Manual de Historia Dominicana by Frank Moya Pons, Composición Social Dominicana by Juan, The Dominican Racial Imaginary by Milagros Ricul, and Introduction to Dominican Blackness by Dr. Silvio Torres Sayan.
And I'll also put all the names to all of these in the description box so y'all can look them up as well.
Cool. Absolutely. This is fantastic.
Yeah. I'm going to now end this interview here. Now, Marcel, you and I did speak of maybe doing like a part 2, getting into the history from the 1800s and forward. So covering I guess I would cover the formation of, Spanish Haiti, the Haitian occupation, the Restoration War, and everything up, I guess, into Trujillo if we want to get into that, so on, so on. I mean, we can do that whenever. It doesn't have to be like anytime soon because I know that's a lot of information that would need to be researched. But that's, something to throw out there that we might do. So to all y'all watching, you guys can stay tuned for that. So again, thank you, Marcel, very much. This was very informational. I hope that everyone that has watched this and that will be watching the replay really enjoy it and they really learn something. And you guys, just one thing I want y'all to keep in mind is just take the emotionality, okay, out of history. Like, history is history. We can't do nothing about it. We can't change it. It is what it is. All right. So just take it for what it is and just be proud of the trajectory of things that have led to us being Dominicans today. Take pride in everything. All the different groups of people, all the ancestors, all the cultural influences that have made Dominicans who we are. So with that, guys, I'm going to conclude this interview here. Marcel doesn't have a channel or anything right now, so I can't link y'all to any social media, but yeah, I'm sure y'all will see him around, whether it's in a live stream or I don't know, in the comment section or somebody else's live. So yeah. All right, Marcel. Well, to everyone watching, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll check everyone in my next video. Bye-bye.
Peace out, everybody. Bye.